Good evening, my friend. Tonight, let us drift together across oceans of time, to an age when gods walked among mortals, and every sunrise was a gift borrowed from fate. Imagine the night air warm around you, the sound of a distant tide weaving through the hush, as a single storyteller's voice begins to shape a world of bronze and fire. This is the world of the Iliad, not only of battles and spears, but of hearts laid bare, of love and grief entwined like ivy over ancient stone. You will hear of men who sought glory, and of those who sought only to return home. Let the images come slowly, the glint of armor in morning light, the murmur of campfires under a dark sky. Rest easy now. The journey is long, but tonight it will carry you gently. When we end, perhaps you will tell me which moment stayed with you. Long before paper held ink, before libraries cradled books in their quiet embrace, there was only the voice. A voice that rose and fell like the sea, carrying with it the weight of centuries. We do not know for certain if there was one man called Homer, or if that name is a tapestry woven from the threads of many tellers who came before. What we do know is that the story of the Iliad lived first in the air, in the breath of singers who could summon cities, storms, and kings with nothing more than memory and song. It is said these poets would walk from village to village, their steps dusty from the road, a lyre slung across their back. At night, by the glow of a single fire, they would call forth the age of heroes, a time when the gods were close enough to hear your prayers in person, and when honor was as solid and heavy as the shield on your arm. In their telling, the air would change. People leaned closer, cups stilled halfway to lips, and the world beyond the circle of firelight would dissolve. Picture it now, the creak of a wooden stool beneath the poet, the silver string of the lyre vibrating softly, the fire popping as sap bursts within the wood. The smell of roasting meat mingles with the salt of the nearby sea. The audience knows these stories by heart, yet they listen as though for the first time, because each telling is a new weaving of the same cloth-familiar patterns made luminous by a different light. And somewhere between the mortal and the divine, between history and myth, stands the Iliad's world. A Greece of proud city-states, some no larger than the sound of a bell, others rich with markets and high walls. It was a world where every man knew the weight of his name, and every woman the fragility of peace. And in the hearts of all was the understanding that life was brief, but honor could outlast the body. The poet's voice slows, as though testing the silence before the storm. He has drawn his listeners into the threshold between their own lives and the ones about to be conjured. For in this world, heroes will rise and fall, and the echoes of their choices will reach us across the ages. In the quiet spaces between verses, the poet lets the world of the age of heroes take root in the listener's mind. The Aegean glimmers under a sun that seems closer than ours, its waves kissed by the breath of the gods themselves. Ships with curved prows rest at anchor in small harbors, their hulls smelling of pitch and pine, each ready to carry warriors to distant fates. Inland, the land rolls into olive groves and grain fields, dotted with shepherds whose songs are carried on the same wind that rattles the bronze fittings of a soldier's armor. In this age, the gods are never far. Zeus might hurl his voice in the rumble of a summer storm. Athena might guide the hand of a skilled craftsman as he carves a spear shaft. Aphrodite might brush the cheek of a young bride, setting in motion a chain of events that will alter the course of nations. The boundaries between mortal and divine are soft, like dawn light dissolving into day. These were the stories the poet knew his listeners needed, not because they told only of glory, but because they explained why the world was as it was. Why a city might rise to power only to be reduced to ruins. Why a hero might win eternal fame, yet lose the life he fought to protect. The Iliad would not be sung merely as entertainment. It was an inheritance, a vessel carrying lessons through generations. The poet's cadence changes now, slowing to let each name settle like a pebble into a still pond. Agamemnon, the proud commander; Achilles, swift and unyielding; Hector, steadfast guardian of Troy; Helen, whose beauty was said to rival the goddesses. Around these names swirl countless others, each with their own tale of love, loss, and longing. They're not only characters, they're constellations in the sky of this world, guiding the listener through a vast and ancient night. And yet, the poet is careful. He knows the listener must feel the peace before they can feel the break, so he lingers on the calm before the war on. Marketplaces alive with the calls of traders, on children chasing each other through dusty streets, on the smell of fresh bread carried from ovens to tables. For this is the life that war will threaten, the life that gives weight to what will be lost. The voice lowers, almost to a whisper, as the poet hints that soon a single choice will set the world ablaze. A wedding, a golden apple, and a decision that will awaken the wrath of gods and men alike. The music of the lyre fades, leaving only the rustle of the fire. The audience leans forward, sensing the change to come. And so, the seeds of the Trojan War are ready to be sown. It began not with the clashing of swords, but with the rustle of silks and the fragrance of flowers. A wedding joyful, sacred, and blessed was being held between the mortal hero Peleus and the sea goddess Thetis. Every god and goddess had been invited, save for one, Eris, the spirit of discord. She came anyway, slipping into the celebration like a shadow among the torches. In her hand she carried a single golden apple, its skin gleaming with a light that seemed not of this world. Upon its surface, a simple inscription, "For the fairest." The gift was not an offering of beauty, but a seed of strife. Hera, queen of the gods, claimed it by right of her station. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, reached for it with the confidence of one who believes herself unchallenged. And Aphrodite, radiant with the grace of love itself, extended her hand with a smile that could melt stone. Their quarrel, whispered at first, grew into a storm. None dared to judge among them, not even Zeus, whose gaze could turn the tide of nations. Instead, the decision was placed into mortal hands. A shepherd prince of Troy, Paris by name, would be asked to choose the fairest of the three. Imagine him now, standing on a green slope above the plains, the breeze carrying the scent of thyme and wildflowers. The three goddesses appear before him in light too brilliant for mortal eyes, each offering not only beauty, but a gift to seal his choice. Hera promises dominion over all kingdoms. Athena offers unmatched wisdom and victory in war. And Aphrodite, her voice soft, her eyes steady, offers love, the most beautiful woman in the world, as his own. Paris does not hesitate long. He gives the golden apple to Aphrodite, and with it sows the first seed of the greatest war his people will ever know. For that woman, Helen of Sparta, is already wed to King Menelaus, and love, once bound by the will of gods, is not easily denied. Even now, in the soft light of this moment, the listener can feel the thread of fate tightening. The laughter and music of Peleus and Thetis' wedding fade into the background, replaced by the quiet hum of inevitability. The choice of one man on one hillside will ripple outward until it touches every corner of the known world. And far away in Sparta, Helen, unaware, walks the palace gardens in the early evening, the sky blushing with sunset. She does not yet know her name will be carried on the lips of poets for thousands of years, nor that her beauty will be blamed for 1,000 deaths. In the days that followed Paris's choice, the air seemed to shift. The hills of Troy glowed in the morning light, as they always had, the harbour still filled with merchant ships heavy with grain, wine and bronze. But within the weave of daily life, an invisible thread of destiny had begun to pull. Paris's heart, once steady in the quiet duties of a Trojan prince, now beat to a different rhythm. Aphrodite had promised him Helen, and the goddess of love does not make idle vows. Guided by her unseen hand, Paris prepared for a journey westward, across the Aegean Sea, toward the glittering halls of Sparta. Imagine the departure oars dipping into still water at dawn, the faint smell of pine tar on the ship's timbers, the sea calm but deep with mystery. Above, gulls circled lazily, their cries fading as Troy's shoreline shrank behind him. In the prow, Paris gazed ahead, not yet knowing if he was sailing toward a blessing or a curse. In Sparta, King Menelaus ruled a court both disciplined and warm. His warriors trained in the courtyard, while servants prepared banquets in the great hall. Helen, the queen, moved among her attendants like sunlight through an open window, warming, illuminating, impossible to ignore. She was more than beautiful. She was composed, intelligent, and possessed of a quiet strength that even her detractors could not deny. When Paris arrived, the city received him with the hospitality due a prince. Feasts were held, gifts exchanged, and conversations lingered late into the night. Yet beneath the courtesy, Aphrodite was at work, weaving her spell like a fine thread through the fabric of Helen's thoughts. Paris spoke to her not only of Troy's wealth and beauty, but of her own, of how her name would be sung beyond the horizon, how she might step into a life where every glance toward her was a hymn. The days stretched into weeks, and soon the murmur of scandal began to stir in shadowed corners. Servants whispered. But by the time Menelaus left Sparta on urgent business, the pattern had been set. Paris and Helen, bound by the goddess's promise, fled together under cover of night, their ship sliding silently into the moonlit waters. In the quiet of that voyage, Helen looked back only once. The distant shore of her homeland, a dark shape against the stars. Ahead lay Troy, unseen yet already shaping itself into both her refuge and her prison. And far away in Mycenae, news of her disappearance would soon reach her husband's brother, Agamemnon. In his heart, a flame was already kindling, a flame that would become the blaze of war. When dawn broke over Sparta, the absence of Helen was more than an empty space in the queen's chambers. It was a wound. Messengers ran through the palace halls, their sandals slapping against stone. Menelaus returned to find his throne occupied by silence and his heart heavy with humiliation. Yet grief was quickly swallowed by rage, and rage demanded action. He summoned his brother, Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, whose reach extended over many Greek kingdoms. The brothers called upon an old oath sworn by Helen's many suitors in her youth, that they would defend her marriage no matter the cost. One by one, kings and warriors answered the call. Odysseus of Ithaca, Diomedes of Argos, Ajax the Greater from Salamis, and many more, each bringing ships and men. In every harbour across Greece, black holes slid into the sea like shadows given purpose. Picture it, a fleet gathering under a sky the colour of steel. Masts swaying in the wind, the sound of rigging snapping against wood. The air was sharp with salt and the faint tang of bronze. On the decks, men checked their armour, spoke in low voices, or stared at the horizon as though trying to see Troy already. Meanwhile, in the city of Troy, the return of Paris and Helen was met with wonder and unease. Some saw it as a triumph, an alliance with the most beautiful woman in the world. Others saw only trouble. The Greeks would not let such an insult pass unchallenged. Priam, king of Troy and father to Paris, listened to both sides. He welcomed Helen with dignity, but in his heart, the first shadows of foreboding began to settle. In the temples, priests made offerings to the gods, seeking favor in the uncertain days ahead. Smoke rose into the pale sky, curling in patterns that seemed to spell out warnings only the gods could read. On the walls, sentries looked out toward the sea, their eyes drawn to the horizon as though they could already sense the sails that would soon appear there. And so, with the winds at their back, the Greeks crossed the Aegean. They came not only for Helen, but for honor, for wealth, for the glory that would live in song long after their bones were dust. The war they brought would last 10 years, reshaping lives and legends alike. The first year would see skirmishes and burning fields. The second, raids on Trojan allies. And so the years would pass, until 9 summers and 9 winters had worn the patience of both sides to a thin, frayed thread. It is here, 9 years into the siege, that the Iliad song will truly begin. 9 years have passed since the first Greek ships darkened the shores of Troy. What began with the cry of oars dipping into the sea has become a long, weary rhythm of siege. The plains between the city walls and the Greek encampment are no longer fields of grain. They are trampled dust, marked by the ruts of chariot wheels and the footprints of countless soldiers. The Greek camp stretches along the shoreline, a city of tents bound together by necessity. Smoke curls upward from cooking fires. The smell of roasting meat mixes with the salt wind off the sea. Ships are drawn up on the beach, their hulls weathered from years beneath the sun. Warriors polish their bronze armor, not out of pride, but out of habit. Small rituals that keep the mind from sinking too deep into boredom or despair. Inside the walls of Troy, life is bent, but not broken. Markets still bustle in the mornings, though the stalls are fewer and the goods more precious. Priests still tend the temples, offering sacrifices to keep the city's gods from turning their faces away. Children still play in the courtyards, their games watched by mothers who glance often toward the distant walls, as if to measure the safety they still provide. Both sides have grown used to the stalemate. Raids and skirmishes punctuate the days, but neither army can claim decisive victory. The Greeks control the sea, their ships preventing supplies from reaching Troy easily. The Trojans hold their city's high walls, gates barred against the enemy. It is a dance of endurance, and both sides know it, and yet the air feels heavier now. Perhaps it is the fatigue that comes from years of unresolved conflict. Perhaps it is something more, the gods shifting their attention, ready to stir the stagnant waters. Among the Greeks, pride and tempers run high. Among the Trojans, hope and patience begin to fray. One man more than any other stands at the heart of what will come next: Achilles, the greatest warrior among the Greeks. Swift-footed, near invincible in battle, his name has become both a weapon and a warning. But even the strongest warrior is not immune to insult, and even the mightiest army can be weakened from within. Far out at sea, the waves strike the shore in their endless rhythm, as they did long before this war began, and as they will long after it ends. But on the plains of Troy, something in that rhythm is about to break. The quarrel that will change everything is approaching, quiet for now, like distant thunder before a storm. The Greek camp is not united by friendship, but by necessity. Each contingent has its own leader, its own customs, its own tempers. At the head stands Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, his authority drawn as much from his pride as from his title. He sees himself as the commander of all Greece, yet he knows that the loyalty of his captains is as changeable as the sea. Agamemnon's tent is the largest in the camp, its entrance flanked by spears and shields polished until they reflect the morning sun. Inside, the air smells faintly of wine and oiled leather. Maps are spread across a low table, lines drawn and redrawn over the years, as if the war might be won by changing where the ink lies. Servants move quietly, careful not to disturb their king's thoughts, for his temper is sharp, and his memory for insults even sharper. Beyond Agamemnon's quarters, the camp hums with the routine of survival. Warriors sharpen their spears on whetstones, their movements slow and practiced. Others mend torn sandals, replate rope, or carve small charms from bone to keep the gods close. Somewhere a lyre is played, its melody thin but persistent, a reminder of home carried into the heart of war. Across the plain, inside Troy, life holds to its patterns with stubborn resolve. Hector, prince of the city and its greatest defender, walks the walls each morning. From here, he can see the Greek ships pulled onto the beach, their black prows like teeth in a great jaw. He knows the names of the leaders who command them. He knows their strengths, their weaknesses. And he knows that one of them, Achilles, has not been seen in battle for days, though the reason is not yet clear. For now, the fighting is limited to skirmishes. Archers loose arrows from the safety of the walls. Greek patrols burn outlying farms. Small bands of warriors clash on the open ground, then retreat to their own lines. But the war's real danger lies not in these encounters. It lies in the pride of the men who lead. The smallest spark could ignite a fire neither side can contain. In the evenings, as the sun slips into the sea, both camps are bathed in the same golden light. The Trojans hear the cries of the gulls. The Greeks smell the faint sweetness of the meadows beyond the city. For a brief hour, it almost seems as though the two sides are simply neighbors, separated by a field. But night falls, the fires are lit, and the truth settles back in. They are enemies, bound in a struggle that has no clear end. And on one such night, Agamemnon makes a decision that will set that end in motion. It began with a plague. No clash of swords, no shouts of victory, only the soft, relentless tolling of death. The Greek camp awoke each morning to fewer voices, fewer footsteps in the sand. Smoke from funeral pyres drifted above the tents, its bitter scent carried inland by the sea breeze. The cause was no mystery. Chryses, a Trojan priest of Apollo, had come to the camp to ransom his daughter, taken as a prize of war by Agamemnon. The king had refused him, and worse, had sent him away with insults that clung like thorns. In answer, Apollo loosed his arrows of plague, each shaft striking unseen yet unerringly. Horses grew thin, men fell fevered, and the sound of coughing spread like ripples in still water. Under pressure from his captains, Agamemnon grudgingly returned the girl, but the loss burned in him like a coal. To show that no man could take from him without consequence, he set his sights on another prize, one belonging to Achilles. Briseis, taken from a captured city, was more than a symbol to Achilles. She was a rare point of gentleness in a life of battle. When Agamemnon's heralds came to take her from his tent, they found him sitting by the sea, his eyes fixed on the horizon as though it might hold an answer. He did not fight them. He did not speak. But in that silence lay a promise more dangerous than any shouted threat. That night, the camp seemed quieter than usual. The usual murmur of dice games and low songs was absent from the section where Achilles' warriors camped. Instead, the sound of the waves rose, steady and unbroken. filling the space where voices should have been. By the shoreline, Achilles stood apart, his bronze armor catching the last light of the setting sun. He called upon his mother, Thetis, the sea goddess, her form rising like mist from the foam. His words were slow, deliberate, each one shaped by wounded pride. He asked her to plead with Zeus himself to grant victory to the Trojans, if only to show the Greeks how much they needed him. Far above, in the cold, clear air of Olympus, the gods began to lean in, listening. The war that had dragged on for nearly a decade was about to shift, not because of any grand strategy, but because two men could not share the same sky without one darkening it for the other. And so, with Achilles withdrawn, the Greek army would face the Trojans without their fiercest defender. The balance was about to tip, and not in their favor. The sun rose pale and thin, casting long shadows across the plain between Troy and the Greek encampment. Without Achilles, the Greeks moved like a body missing its strongest limb, still standing, still breathing, but less certain of its strength. In the first days after his withdrawal, some thought little would change. The camp still stirred at dawn, armor was still strapped, horses still harnessed. But the absence of Achilles was like a missing heartbeat, an absence you only notice when you try to run and find yourself slower than you remember. The Trojans noticed. From the walls of the city, Hector watched the Greek lines with the steady patience of a hunter. His men were eager, too eager perhaps, whispering that the time had come to press the advantage. Yet Hector held them back for the right moment. He knew the rhythm of battle as a musician knows a song. You do not strike your loudest note at the first bar. Meanwhile, in the Greek camp, Agamemnon tried to mask his unease. He issued orders with the same voice as before, but the other leaders heard the strain beneath it. Odysseus, wise enough to see what pride had cost them, counseled patience. But he also knew that patience in war was a resource more fragile than gold. For Achilles, the war had shrunk to the size of his tent. He sat apart from the clamor, listening instead to the endless murmur of the sea. Briseis was gone, taken by the same man who claimed to lead Greece to victory. Her absence was not only a personal wound, it was a symbol of how easily honor could be stripped away, even from the most honored man. Sometimes he would walk the shore at night, the moon laying a silver path across the water. The sand cooled beneath his feet, the foam hissed softly as waves receded, and the war seemed very far away. But each time he turned back to his tent, the sounds of camp reminded him that the war was still there, pressing in like the tide. The gods watched closely. On Olympus, the air shimmered with debate. Hera and Athena favored the Greeks, but Thetis's plea to Zeus weighed heavily. The king of the gods agreed to tilt the scales toward the Trojans, at least for a time, so that the Greeks would feel the loss of their greatest warrior. The next morning, the Trojan gates swung open. Chariots rolled forward, their wheels slicing through the dust, the horses' breath steaming in the cool air. The first clash came like the striking of a drum spears, meeting shields, arrows cutting the sky. Without Achilles at the front, the Greeks gave ground slowly but surely. From a distance, Achilles heard the distant roar of battle. He did not rise. His hands rested on his knees, fingers curled but still. Yet somewhere deep inside, a current was moving slow at first, but gathering force like a river swelling under hidden rains. The wrath had begun, but it was still far from its flood. The days that followed were marked by the steady advance of the Trojans. What had once been a war of cautious strikes and guarded retreats now became a push that carried them beyond the safety of their own walls. Hector led the charge, his chariot cutting through the dust like a blade through cloth. The sound of hooves thundered over the plain, and the Greek lines bent beneath the force. In the Greek camp, the air was thick with frustration. Agamemnon barked orders, but even his voice could not hide the shrinking of their territory. The defensive line drew closer to the ships each day, and the smell of pitch used to seal the holes became a constant reminder of how close the fighting was to their only means of return. Men began to speak openly of Achilles. Some cursed him for his pride, others defended his grievance, but all agreed that without him, the Greeks were weaker. Odysseus tried to hold the leaders together, reminding them that victory could still be found, but even his words could not fill the space Achilles had left empty. On the walls of Troy, the people watched with cautious hope. Mothers carried their children up to see Hector ride, their small faces pressed to the cool stone as they followed the glint of his armor. Priests offered sacrifices in the temples, smoke curling into the clear sky. The city, long weary of siege, began to breathe a little easier. But war is never simple. Each advance carried a cost, and Hector knew it. For every step gained, men fell. The cries of the wounded followed him back through the gates at night, and in the stillness of his home, he could feel the weight of each life. Yet the promise of victory kept him moving forward. Meanwhile, Achilles remained apart. He heard the rumors, knew the Trojans were pressing hard, but his pride was a chain as much as it was armor. He told himself the Greeks had chosen their side when they allowed Agamemnon to take Briseis. Let them see what war is without him. Let them feel the edge of their own arrogance. At night, the sea spoke to him in the voice of his mother, Thetis. She reminded him that his fate was bound to this war, that he could not hide from it forever. But for now, Achilles kept his anger banked, a fire smoldering low, waiting for the right wind to turn it into flame. The gods continued to shape the tide. Zeus, honoring his promise to Thetis, gave strength to the Trojans. The battles grew bloodier, the Greek wounds deeper. The scent of burning pyres rose daily, mingling with the salt air until the whole camp seemed steeped in smoke and grief. And still, the greatest warrior in Greece did not lift his spear. The tide of war swelled until it lapped at the very edges of the Greek ships. Hector's chariot wheels churned the sand not far from the hulls, and the cries of the Trojans echoed across the beach like the rush of a storm tide. The once spacious camp felt smaller now, compressed between the advancing enemy and the unyielding sea. Men who had once spoken with confidence now muttered in low voices, their eyes flicking toward the shore as though measuring the distance to safety. Armor was mended in haste, shields patched with whatever could be found. The smell of salt mingled with the sharper tang of pitch as the Greeks prepared their ships, not for attack, but for the possibility of retreat. Agamemnon, wounded in both body and pride, called council after council, each ending in more argument than agreement. Odysseus urged the king to make peace with Achilles, but Agamemnon's jaw remained set, his words heavy with resentment. "If he will not fight for Greece," he said, "let him rot in his tent." Yet even as he spoke, the truth weighed on him. Without Achilles, the war might be lost. In the Trojan camp, the mood was fierce with momentum. Hector spoke to his warriors of a final blow that could drive the Greeks into the sea. Fires burned late into the night. The smell of roasting meat and fresh bread carried on the wind, a cruel contrast to the hunger gnawing in the Greek lines. But Hector also knew that victory was a fragile thing. He had seen too many battles turn in a single moment, too many strong men fall to a single stroke. And it was in these days, as the Greeks struggled to hold their ground, that Patroclus watched in silence from Achilles' side. He saw the wounded carried past, heard the ragged breathing of men who had fought without hope of relief. Each night, the sound of distant combat seemed to gnaw at his chest. Patroclus knew Achilles' anger was justified, but he also knew the cost was being paid in the blood of their friends. In the quiet of their tent, he spoke cautiously. "If you will not fight, then let me go in your armor. Let them think Achilles has returned, and they will rally." Achilles studied him for a long moment, the firelight painting deep shadows across his face. He agreed, but with a warning. "Drive them from the ships, Patroclus, but go no further. Do not seek glory, for it will only bring the gods notice, and their notice is death." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the smell of rain and distant thunder. The moment of decision had come, and with it, the first cracks in the wall of Achilles' wrath. Soon, the war would know his name again, but not in the way he imagined. The morning broke under a pale, restless sky, the kind that seemed unsure whether to promise rain or sun. In Achilles' tent, the air was heavy with the scent of oiled bronze. Patroclus stood still as the Myrmidons, Achilles' own warriors, fastened the armor piece by piece around him. The breastplate gleamed, its polished surface catching the muted light like a shard of dawn. The plumes of the helmet swayed slightly as he moved, and the weight on his shoulders felt heavier than any armor he had worn before. Outside, the camp stirred with whispers. Word spread quickly. Achilles had returned to the field. Men straightened their backs, hands gripped spears more firmly, and the lines of worry etched into weathered faces eased, if only slightly. Hope, that most fragile of weapons, began to sharpen again. Patroclus mounted Achilles' chariot, its horses, Xanthus and Balius, pawing the sand with impatient strength. Automedon, Achilles' charioteer, took the reins, his eyes fixed ahead. As they wheeled toward the front, the Myrmidons followed in a tight formation, their shields catching the light, their spears angled like a forest of bronze. The Greeks' camp seemed to come alive as they passed. Men raised their voices in greeting. Others struck their shields with spear shafts in salute. The sound rolled outward like the crest of a wave, carrying with it the belief that the tide of war could be turned. Across the plain, the Trojans felt the change. From the high walls of Troy, women and elders watched as the Myrmidons formed up. Some murmured that it was Achilles himself, returned to avenge the insults and losses of the past days. Hector, narrowing his eyes against the glare, sensed something was different but could not yet name it. The signal came, a sharp cry from Automedon, and the chariot surged forward. The horses' hooves struck the packed earth in a rhythm that matched the pounding of war drums. The Myrmidons charged, their bronze armor flashing, the sound of their advance a rising storm. The first clash was sudden and fierce. Trojan lines buckled under the weight of the assault. Shields driven back, spears splintered. Patroclus fought with the speed and force of a man carrying more than his own strength. In that moment, he carried the expectations of the entire Greek host. For a time, the plain seemed to tilt toward the sea, the Trojans driven from the black-hulled ships they had threatened for days. Smoke from half-built fires drifted across the sand, mingling with the dust and the cries of the wounded. The Greeks pressed forward, seizing ground they had nearly lost. But in the midst of the noise and chaos, the gods watched, their eyes narrowing. They saw not Achilles, but a mortal wearing his shadow, and they began to murmur among themselves. Patroclus, flushed with the momentum of victory, pushed the Trojans farther than he had intended. And somewhere in the distance, Hector was turning his chariot to meet him. The momentum carried Patroclus like a strong current, sweeping him deeper into the tide of battle. With every clash, the Trojans yielded ground. Their chariots wheeled in retreat. Their shields rattled under the force of Myrmidon spears, and the dust of their flight rose in golden clouds against the sun. Patroclus fought with a fire born not of glory-seeking, but of desperate purpose. Each strike was for the friends he had seen wounded, each step forward to keep the flames from touching the Greek ships. In Achilles' armor, he seemed untouchable, the bronze plates ringing with each blow like the notes of a war song sung by the gods themselves. The Trojans, seeing the Myrmidons advancing, began to break. Archers retreated toward the gates, cavalry splintered, and those still standing looked often over their shoulders, weighing each heartbeat against the chance to live another day. From the walls of Troy, the watchers murmured in fear. The old men recognized the gleam of Achilles' armor and thought him returned in wrath. Mothers gathered their children close, turning them away from the sight of men cut down in the dust. Even within the safety of the high gates, the shadow of defeat crept in. Patroclus pursued them to the very edge of the plain, where the river Scamander wound like a silver ribbon through the earth. Here the battle's roar seemed to spread in all directions. The clang of bronze on bronze, the neighing of horses, the shouts of men pressing forward. But in his chest, a dangerous exhilaration was building. He had done what Achilles had asked, driven the Trojans from the ships. And yet, as the Myrmidons roared in triumph, he felt the pull of something greater. The taste of what it would mean to end the war entirely. He began to strike down Trojan captains, his spear flashing in the afternoon light. Each fall of an enemy seemed to open the path wider, to beckon him farther forward. He saw Hector's chariot in the distance, its horses lathered, its wheels streaked with the dust of the retreat. The gods were watching closely now. Apollo, protector of Troy, descended into the fray unseen, brushing Patroclus' shoulder like a whisper of cold wind. The touch was gentle, but it carried the weight of warning. Yet in the rush of victory, Patroclus did not turn back. Behind him, Automedon called out, reminding him of Achilles' words, urging caution. But the sound was swallowed by the din of battle. Ahead, Hector was wheeling his horses toward him, and the space between them seemed to narrow with every heartbeat. The plain, once wide and scattered with men, now felt as if it had drawn in around this single point, this single meeting toward which all events had been moving. And as Patroclus advanced, the sunlight on his armor burned like a beacon, visible to all who looked upon the field. The dust hung heavy in the air, turning the afternoon light to bronze. Patroclus and Hector closed the space between them, each knowing the other's name, each aware that this meeting would be remembered long after the war itself was gone. Hector's chariot bore down first, the hooves of his horses pounding the earth in a rhythm as steady as a war drum. His eyes were fixed, not on the man's face, hidden beneath the plumed helmet, but on the unmistakable gleam of Achilles' armor. To him, this was the moment to prove himself against the greatest warrior alive. Patroclus stood his ground. He lowered his spear, feeling its weight settle in his grip, and braced as the chariot swept close. The first pass was a test. Hector's spear struck Patroclus's shield, shoving him back a step, but not breaking his stance. The second was faster, harder, the bronze tips of their weapons glancing off each other with a sound like striking stone. Around them, the battle thinned. Both Greeks and Trojans paused, drawn to the duel as if the outcome would decide not just the day's fighting, but the fate of the war itself. The shouts of men fell to a low murmur, the clamor of weapons fading into the background. Even the river Scamander seemed to still its flow, as though the land itself was holding its breath. On the third clash, Hector's spear glanced wide, but before Patroclus could press his advantage, a force unseen struck him from behind. A sudden, numbing blow. Apollo's hand had found him again, this time with no gentleness. His vision blurred, his knees weakened. In that instant of vulnerability, another Trojan warrior drove a spear into his side, not deep enough to kill, but enough to break his rhythm. Hector seized the opening. His spear thrust found its mark, slipping past the armor to where no bronze could protect. Patroclus staggered, the strength flowing out of him as if the earth had opened beneath his feet. The spear fell from his hands, clattering to the ground. Hector stepped close, his voice low, meant only for the man before him. "You thought to take our city," he said, "but you will not see its gates fall." Patroclus's breath came in ragged gasps. He lifted his gaze, meeting Hector's eyes through the narrowing tunnel of his vision. "It was not I you fought today," he whispered. "Achilles will come for you." With that, the light in his eyes dimmed, and he fell. The dust rose around him, settling slowly, as if reluctant to cover the man who had worn the armor of another and carried the hope of a weary army. Hector looked down, his triumph edged with unease. For even in victory, he felt the shadow of a storm rising from the Greek camp, a storm that bore a single name: Achilles. The moment Patroclus fell, the sound of battle seemed to change. It was no longer the clashing of shields and the hiss of arrows, but something deeper. A shift in the air, a weight settling over the plain. Men who had been fighting froze for a heartbeat, glancing toward the place where the dust still hung over his body. Hector stood above him, his chest rising and falling, the tip of his spear stained. He bent briefly to strip the body of Achilles' armor, each piece coming away with a metallic sigh. The breastplate, the greaves, the crested helmet, all lifted and carried away, leaving Patroclus lying in the dust in the simple linen beneath. Without the armor's gleam, he looked almost ordinary, almost like any other fallen soldier. And yet those who knew him felt the loss as a wound within their own ribs. The Trojans rallied around Hector, their voices lifting in shouts that rolled across the field like surf against rock. They did not yet understand what they had done, not fully. They saw a victory, not the awakening of the fury that would follow. Among the Greeks, the sight struck like a hammer. The Myrmidons faltered, their formation breaking as the truth reached them. Automedon, still in the chariot, cried out Patroclus's name. But the horses, sensing the change in the air, tossed their heads and stamped, refusing to move forward. The fight over Patroclus's body began almost immediately. Both sides surged toward it. Trojans seeking to carry it off as a trophy. Greeks desperate to reclaim their fallen comrade. Spears met in the air, shields locked, and the dust rose again in thick clouds, hiding faces and blurring the edges of the world. Through it all, Patroclus lay still. The sun shifted, shadows lengthened, and the battle raged over and around him. His hair was matted with dust, his hands curled loosely as if still holding an unseen weapon. In the quiet of his face, there was no trace of the violence that had taken him, only a kind of weary calm, as if some part of him had known this was where the path would end. News traveled quickly in a camp at war. Before the sun had reached its lowest point, word of Patroclus's death had reached Achilles. The messenger stood at the entrance of his tent, hesitant, knowing the weight of the news he carried. Achilles, seated by the sea, did not look up until the man spoke his name. The words were simple, but they cut like bronze. Patroclus has fallen. For a long moment, Achilles did not move. Then he rose slowly, as if the air had grown heavier, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the battlefield lay unseen. The waves hissed at the shore, the same as they had every day, but the sound no longer soothed him. Somewhere out there lay the body of the man who had been his closest friend, and the man who had taken his life still breathed. The sea wind caught at his hair, but Achilles did not feel it. Only one thing filled him now, the knowledge that his wrath would no longer be contained. The words settled into Achilles like stones sinking into deep water. At first, there was only the heaviness, the slow descent of grief through his chest, down into his gut. He turned away from the messenger without speaking, stepping out onto the narrow strip of beach where the tide had just begun to fall. The damp sand gave beneath his feet, and each step left a hollow that filled slowly with seawater. He had not wept in years, not for comrades fallen, not for family left far behind, but now the tears came, unbidden and unashamed, hot against the salt wind. He dropped to his knees at the edge of the surf, the waves foaming around him, and let the grief take him whole. From the depths, Thetis rose, his mother, her form like water-given shape, her hair trailing like strands of silver kelp. She came without sound, only the soft rush of the tide marking her presence. When she knelt beside him, her hand was cool against his cheek. "My son," she said, her voice as low as the sea's own breath. "I know why you call me." Achilles could not answer at first. He could only shake his head, the weight of what had been lost pressing on his chest. Finally, the words broke through, harsh and raw. "He is dead, mother. Hector has taken his life, and my armor with it. I sent him out there, and I told him to come back. He did not come back." Thetis's eyes held both sorrow and inevitability. "You know what it will mean if you return to the battle. You will kill Hector, yes, but after that, your own death will follow. The fates have already measured the thread." "I know," Achilles said, his voice steady now, though the salt of tears still touched his lips. "If I stay, I will live. But what life is left to me without him? The songs will end, the war will pass, but I will still see his face each time I close my eyes." Thetis looked away toward the horizon, where the sea met the paling sky. "Then I will go to Hephaestus," she said, "and he will forge you armor greater than any the world has seen. But until it is ready, hold your fury in check if you can." In the camp, word of Achilles' grief spread like the firelight that flickered through the rows of tents. The Myrmidons kept to themselves, their faces hard, their voices low. Among the other Greeks, there was a restless stirring. Some felt hope at the thought of his return, others feared the cost. That night, Achilles lay beside the empty space where Patroclus had once slept. He did not close his eyes. His hands rested over his chest, fingers curled loosely as if already holding a spear. Outside, the waves whispered against the shore, but their rhythm no longer spoke of peace. It counted down the moments until the storm broke. Somewhere beyond the darkness, Hector slept within the walls of Troy, unaware that the shadow moving toward him was no longer bound by pride or insult, but by grief sharpened into purpose. The body of Patroclus still lay where he had fallen, the dust clinging to his hair, the sunlight dimming as the day leaned toward evening. Around him, the battle had grown into a desperate struggle. Greeks surging forward to reclaim him, Trojans pressing back to keep their prize. Ajax the Greater fought at the front, his massive shield a wall that turned aside, spear and arrow alike. Beside him, Menelaus shouted orders, driving his men to hold their ground, while others moved in to lift the fallen. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and blood, and the cries of the dying wove through the clash of bronze. Hector, now wearing the gleaming armor of Achilles, led the Trojan charge. The sight of it shook the Greeks, for in the chaos it seemed almost as if Achilles himself had turned against them. The armor caught the last light of the sun, flaring gold, as Hector drove his chariot into the fray. Yet even with Hector pressing hard, the Greeks did not yield. They locked their shields and inched forward, step by step, until they could reach the body. Menelaus bent to lift Patroclus by the shoulders, his grip steady even as a spear grazed his arm. Behind him, Ajax roared, his shield swinging out to strike down a Trojan who had come too close. Finally, the line held long enough for the Myrmidons to join them. With fierce determination, they bore Patroclus back toward the camp, their steps sure despite the weight they carried. All the while, the Trojans followed, loosing arrows and calling out taunts that carried faintly over the din. At the edge of the camp, Achilles awaited them. He had not gone into the battle, bound by his promise to Thetis until the new armor was ready, but the sight of his friend's body struck him as no weapon ever could. They laid Patroclus on a bier within his tent. His face was pale beneath the dust. His lips parted slightly as though still about to speak. Achilles knelt beside him, his hand hovering above the still chest before finally resting there. For a long time, he said nothing, his gaze fixed on the features he knew so well. When he rose, his voice was low but clear, carrying to every man gathered outside the tent. "Hector will pay for this," he said. "Not because I hate him more than any other man in Troy, but because he has taken from me the one who was as my own soul. I will not eat, I will not sleep, until I have driven my spear into him and sent him to the house of Hades." The men bowed their heads. They had seen Achilles in battle before, but never like this. His wrath now tempered by loss, his pride replaced with something heavier and far more dangerous. That night, the camp was quiet. The fires burned low, and the only sounds were the faint hiss of the sea and the slow steps of the guards moving along the shore. Somewhere in the darkness, Thetis was already on her way back from Hephaestus's forge, carrying the armor that would shine like a second sun over the plains of Troy. In the depths of night, far from the noise of men, the forge of Hephaestus glowed with the light of molten fire. The god of the smith's art moved with sure, measured strokes, his great hands shaping bronze as though it were soft clay. Sparks leapt upward like small stars, scattering against the shadowed walls of the workshop. The hiss of quenching steam was the only sound between hammer blows. Thetis stood nearby, her eyes never leaving the work. She had told him what was needed, armor worthy of a warrior who would not return from this war alive. Hephaestus listened without questions, for the gods already knew the thread of Achilles' fate. Piece by piece, the armor took shape, a breastplate that caught the fire's glow like sunlight on a calm sea. Greaves etched with spirals like waves breaking on shore. A helmet crowned with a horsehair plume that trembled as though stirred by an unseen wind. Most wondrous of all was the shield, a wide disc alive with scenes of mortal life and divine order. Cities in festival, fields heavy with grain, herds in pasture, ships on calm and storm-tossed seas, the stars wheeling above it all. It was the world itself, held in bronze. When the work was done, Thetis took the armor into her arms, its weight no burden to her. She left the forge and moved through the night, the sea opening before her as she returned to her son. Achilles waited on the shore, the waves sliding in and out like the breath of something ancient. He had not slept. His eyes had not left the horizon. When Thetis emerged from the surf, the moonlight struck the armor in her hands, and for a moment it seemed that the dawn had come early. "My son," she said softly, "I bring you what you need to end this war." He rose and took the breastplate, the cold bronze warming quickly against his skin. As he donned each piece, a stillness came over him. Not the stillness of peace, but of a man whose path is now set. The helmet's plume swayed slightly as he fastened it. The shield felt alive beneath his grip. Outside his tent, the Myrmidons gathered, their faces lit by the first pale hints of dawn. They saw the armor and knew that the day had come. The sound of the sea faded beneath the growing murmur of voices, a low hum of anticipation that seemed to vibrate in the air. Achilles stood before them, his voice steady. "Today, we fight for Patroclus. Today, we drive the Trojans back to their gates. And today, I will meet Hector." The men struck their spears against their shields, the sound rolling like distant thunder. In that moment, even the wind seemed to pause, as though the plain of Troy itself was listening. The first rays of dawn crept over the Aegean, painting the sea in streaks of gold and rose. In the Greek camp, the Myrmidons were already arrayed in full armor, their black shields catching the light like the wings of ravens. At their head stood Achilles, the new forged bronze of his armor gleaming so brightly that it seemed to carry its own light separate from the sun. When he stepped forward, the men moved with him as one body. Each stride sent a faint shiver through the line, a rhythm that began in his footsteps and passed through theirs. The sand under their feet was still cool, but the air already carried the scent of heat and iron, the taste of battle before a single blow had been struck. From the walls of Troy, the watchers saw him and stilled. Whispers passed from one to another. Achilles had returned. Mothers pulled their children back from the parapets, while the elders stood silently, remembering the last time this warrior had entered the fray. Then his name had meant terror. Now, after Patroclus' death, it meant something colder, inevitability. The Trojans were already in formation on the plain, Hector at their center. The gleam of Achilles' armor caught his eye even from a distance. He knew in an instant that this was no ruse. This was the man himself, and the weight of what was to come pressed on him like a physical thing. The charge began with no shouted order, no rallying cry. Achilles simply moved forward, and the Myrmidons followed. The earth shook beneath the pounding of their feet, the sound swelling until it filled the plain. The Greeks who had been holding the front lines fell back in organized relief, letting Achilles and his men take the lead. The first clash was brutal. Achilles struck like lightning, his spear finding gaps in armor as if the bronze itself bent away from him. Trojans fell before they could even raise their shields, the dust swallowing their cries. The Myrmidons pressed hard behind him, their formation driving deep into the heart of the enemy lines. Everywhere Achilles moved, the battle seemed to tilt. His shield caught the glare of the sun, dazzling those who faced him. His spear swept in arcs too fast to follow, each thrust leaving another man in the dust. It was not the methodical advance of an army. It was the storming of a single will across the plain, dragging the tide with it. Hector tried to rally his men, calling for them to hold their ground. But the sight of Achilles unbroken and advancing was too much for many. The lines wavered, then broke in places, forcing the Trojans to fall back toward the city. Still, Achilles did not slow. He moved like a man for whom the future had already been decided. His only task to cut through the present until nothing remained between him and the one he sought. And somewhere within the city gates, as word spread, the name Hector was spoken with a new and growing urgency. For all knew that this day would end with a meeting between the two greatest warriors of the age, one driven by duty, the other by grief, sharpened into vengeance. The plain of Troy became a river of dust and bronze, its current flowing wherever Achilles willed it. Each step he took seemed to carve a channel through the battle, his spear and shield parting the Trojan ranks as water parts around a rock. The Myrmidons followed close, their discipline unbroken, their spears striking in unison with the rhythm of his movements. He moved without hesitation, every thrust precise, every block instinctive. Men who faced him felt not just the fear of a great warrior, but the weight of inevitability, as if the day had already been written and they were only acting out its end. The cries of the dying were muffled beneath the roar of feet and the clash of bronze, and in the chaos, Achilles was always moving forward. The Trojans fell back in waves, their lines contracting toward the safety of the gates. Chariots wheeled sharply to avoid him, their horses wild-eyed and frothing, while archers loosed, hurried shots that rattled harmlessly from his shield. In the distance, the walls of Troy loomed higher with each step, the sun glinting off their stone as if daring him to come closer. But Achilles did not yet rush the gates. He cut across the field, driving the Trojans away from the river crossings and the open ground where they could regroup. When a cluster of warriors tried to hold their position, he struck like a falcon into a flock, scattering them in moments. His spear moved so quickly that it seemed to leave afterimages in the dusty air. Behind him, the Myrmidons secured the ground he had cleared, making certain no Trojan would find a path to circle back. Other Greek contingents, emboldened by the sight of Achilles, pressed forward from the flanks, their own shouts rising in a renewed chorus of war. From the high walls, the people of Troy watched in silence. The figure in shining bronze below was not merely a man. They saw in him the embodiment of the Greeks' relentless will, the shadow that had hung over their city for 9 long years, now made solid and unstoppable. Inside the gates, messengers ran to Hector. He stood in the courtyard, helmet under his arm, listening as each breathless voice reported the same truth. Achilles was cutting through their army, and no one could stand against him. The space between them was shrinking with every passing moment. Hector's jaw tightened. He knew that to remain within the walls while Achilles roamed the plain would be to invite the scorn of his people and the slow erosion of their courage. He also knew that to face Achilles was to step into the mouth of fate. Still, he gave the order to prepare his chariot. The wheels were checked, the horses bridled, the bronze fittings polished, though the hour was late. He fastened his armor with hands that did not tremble. Each strap pulled tight, as though it might hold his resolve in place. Outside, the noise of battle drew nearer, the steady beat of footsteps and the metallic clang of weapons growing louder with every breath. The plain between the city gates and Achilles was no longer filled with soldiers. It was an open space, an invitation neither man would refuse. The meeting was coming, and all who watched, from wall and camp alike, knew that when it happened, the fate of Troy itself would shift. The plain before Troy lay strangely quiet now, save for the faint hiss of wind through trampled grass and the distant creak of chariot wheels. Where moments before the field had been choked with men and noise, there was now a wide, empty stretch. An arena formed not by design, but by the sheer force of Achilles' advance. Hector stepped out from the gates, the shadow of the great walls stretching long behind him. The bronze of his armor glinted faintly under the sun, though it lacked the almost blinding sheen of the armor he had taken from Patroclus. Achilles' own now forged anew. His eyes, dark and steady, swept the open ground where his enemy waited. Achilles stood apart from the Greek lines, shield resting against his side, spear held loose in his right hand. The new armor caught the light in shifting gold, its surface alive with the scenes wrought by Hephaestus' hand. But it was not the armor that held Hector's attention. It was the stillness of the man within it. For a long moment, neither moved. The air between them seemed to hum, charged with the weight of all that had passed to bring them here. The years of siege, the insult to Achilles, the death of Patroclus. From the walls above, Priam watched in silence, his hands gripping the stone so tightly that his knuckles whitened. Beside him, Andromache's heart pounded in her chest as she searched her husband's figure for any sign that he might turn back. Then Achilles began to walk forward, each step slow but unbroken. Hector felt the pull in his chest, a primal warning that this was no ordinary foe, that this was the man the gods themselves had lifted above all others in war. For the briefest moment, fear brushed against him, light as a bird's wing. And then, just as quickly, pride pushed it away. Yet as Achilles drew nearer, the weight of that pride grew heavy. Hector's gaze flicked once toward the gates, to the safety they offered, to the faces of those who would watch him live or die. In that instant, his heart urged retreat, and so he turned. He broke into a run, his feet pounding the earth, the long plumes of his helmet streaming behind him. Achilles surged forward in pursuit, the chase beginning in a flash of dust. They circled the walls once, twice, 3 times, each man pushing himself to the edge of exhaustion. The sound of their footfalls echoed up to the ramparts, where the people of Troy leaned forward in breathless silence. On Olympus, the gods watched. Some smiled at the contest, others turned away, unwilling to see the moment that must come. At last, Athena, in the guise of Hector's brother Deiphobus, appeared before him on the plain. She called out, urging him to stop, promising to fight at his side. Believing her, Hector slowed, turned, and raised his spear. And there, in the still space between breaths, the chase ended. Hector stood still now, his chest rising and falling, the heat of the chase still in his limbs. Across from him, Achilles slowed his approach, his steps deliberate, eyes fixed on the man before him. The space between them was small enough that each could see the other's breath mist in the cooling air. "You will have no escape this time," Achilles said, his voice low and even. "You took the life of Patroclus and stripped his armor from his body. For that, I will see you laid in the dust." Hector's grip tightened on his spear. "I did not fear you before, Achilles, and I do not now. I will face you as a warrior should, and if the gods will it, I will take your life here." They circled each other slowly, the dust shifting under their feet. The walls of Troy loomed nearby, so close Hector could hear faint cries from the ramparts, his father's voice among them, urging him to come inside. But his pride and the presence of the one he had long known he must face kept him rooted here. Achilles moved first, his spear darting forward in a thrust meant to test, not kill. Hector turned it aside with his shield, the clash ringing in the air. He countered with his own thrust, the tip of his spear grazing the rim of Achilles' shield. For a moment they were locked in the rhythm of attack and parry, each reading the other's movements with the instinct of seasoned warriors. Then Hector lunged, aiming for the gap at Achilles' neck. But the new armor, forged by Hephaestus, fit so perfectly that no gap was there to be found. Achilles twisted away, his shield pushing Hector's spear aside, and in the same motion he hurled his own spear. Hector dropped low, the spear flashing over him to bury itself in the earth behind. He straightened quickly, drawing in a sharp breath, only to see Achilles advancing without pause, drawing his sword in a smooth arc. The blades met with a sharp, ringing sound. Sparks flared briefly in the dust between them. Hector felt the force of Achilles' strike travel up his arm, numbing his fingers. He stepped back, seeking a better footing, and in that instant, Achilles' shield slammed into him. The blow staggered him, sending him to one knee. Achilles moved in, his shadow falling over Hector. "There will be no mercy," he said, not with cruelty, but with the certainty of a man delivering what fate had already decreed. With one final thrust, Achilles drove his spear into the unguarded spot at Hector's throat. The bronze pierced clean through, and Hector fell, the dust rising around him in a soft cloud. His voice was weak now, but steady. "I beg you, return my body to my family. Let me not be left to the dogs." Achilles looked down, his face unreadable. "The dogs will have you, Hector. Patroclus lies cold because of you." The light faded from Hector's eyes. Above, the cries from Troy rose like the sound of the sea breaking against the rocks. Achilles withdrew his spear, and the world seemed to grow still around them. The dust had barely settled when Achilles placed his foot on Hector's chest and wrenched his spear free. The body lay still, the proud bronze armor gleaming under the sun. But it was no longer Hector's. That armor had once belonged to Patroclus, to Achilles himself, and now it was stained with the blood of the man who had worn it in defiance. Achilles stood over him for a long moment, his shadow long and dark across the ground. Around them, the Greek soldiers gathered, some silent, others murmuring at the sight of the city's champion lying in the dust. In their eyes, this was justice. In Achilles' eyes, it was only a step toward easing the wound in his heart. Without a word, he stripped Hector of the armor, leaving the body bare beneath the sun. Then, with a coldness that drew uneasy glances, even from his own men, Achilles pierced the heels of the corpse and tied them with leather thongs to the back of his chariot. The horses pawed the ground, their breath heavy in the heat, and with a sharp command, Achilles turned them toward the Greek camp. The body dragged in the dust, leaving a long, broken trail behind. The sight was terrible. Triumph and desecration bound together in one motion. From the walls of Troy, the cries began. Priam, the king, leaned far over the parapet, his voice breaking as he called his son's name into the wind. The sound carried over the plain, raw and unrestrained, reaching even the Greek soldiers below. Inside the walls, Andromache had not yet seen what had happened. She was in her chambers, overseeing the weaving of a great cloth when the sound of mourning rose from the streets. A servant rushed in, her face pale, and in halting words told her what had befallen Hector. The shuttle fell from Andromache's hands, clattering to the floor. She ran to the wall, her breath sharp in her chest. And when she saw the truth, Hector's body dragged behind the chariot, the dust rising in its wake. Her cry joined her father-in-law's, the two voices weaving grief into the very air above the city. In the Greek camp, there was no celebration. Even those who hated Troy most felt the weight of what Achilles had done. Victory was one thing, the desecration of an enemy's body was another. Yet none spoke against him, for the fire in his eyes was still too bright, and his name too feared. Achilles did not stop when he reached the camp. He circled Patroclus' funeral mound 3 times, Hector's body tracing a path in the dirt. Only when the sun dipped low did he have the corpse laid near his tent, where he could see it from the entrance. Night fell over Troy and the Greek camp alike, but the city did not sleep. In the darkness, torches burned on the walls, the flames wavering as if stirred by the breath of the gods themselves. And in the quiet between the flicker of those flames and the sound of the distant sea, the thought settled into every heart. Hector was gone, and nothing would ever be the same. When the wailing in Troy at last thinned to a hoarse whisper, Priam rose from where he had sunk beside the gate, his hands raw from gripping the stone. The old king moved like a man learning his body again, each step an act of will. Servants hovered and withdrew, unsure whether to offer help or to leave him to the solemn privacy of grief. He asked for no food, called for no counsel. He only stood at the threshold of his palace and watched the torches gutter in the night wind, listening to the city breathe in ragged sobs. In the inner court, the floor was cool beneath his bare feet. He walked toward the quiet shrine where he had spoken to the gods since youth, a place that smelled of old smoke and laurel. There he laid his hands on the smooth altar stone and spoke not as a king but as a father, words without ornament, simple and low, asking not for victory, not even for justice, but for the return of a son's body to a mother's arms. The flame on the altar bent once, as if to hear him better, then steadied. Hecuba came softly. Her face veiled, her steps careful as though any sudden motion might break the fragile balance keeping her upright. They did not speak at first. Their silence said what words could not, that the season of pride was over and only love remained. When at last she found her voice, it was gentle but firm. "Go," she said, as if the single word were a thread she placed in his hand. "Bring him home." Priam inclined his head, accepting not command but blessing. He called for Idaeus, the trustworthy herald whose eyes missed nothing and whose tongue never outran wisdom. Quiet orders followed: a stout mule cart, well-axled and silent, rugs and cloaks to shroud and cushion, caskets of gold and hammered silver, bright wrought bowls that had known only festival, a triple measured ransom fit to honor a prince and soften a foe. Priam chose each piece with a father's care, fingers lingering over patterns he remembered from the days when Hector was small and chased dust motes through sunlight. Outside, the night had cooled the stones. The city, so loud at dusk, was subdued now into soft footfalls and low muttering at doorways. The stars lay thick over the plain. Priam stood beneath them a long while, measuring the distance from gate to sea, not by paces, but by the courage stored in his aging bones. He felt the weight of the years settle across his shoulders like a cloak, and yet beneath it, something lighter, a clarity that comes when there is only one thing left to do. At the gate, the guards, stern men with salt in their hair and loyalty in their posture, knelt as he approached. He told them he would pass alone, save for Idaeus, and their protests were brief, swallowed by the look in his eyes. The great doors sighed open. Beyond them, the plain was a dark ocean, the Greek fires constellations along the shore. Idaeus took the mule cart's lead, and Priam set one hand upon the rail. They went out into the night without escort, without trumpet, without prayer said aloud, the hush around them a kind of blessing. Each wheel turn on the hard earth beat time, not of war, but of love crossing the space where armies had stood for years. Far ahead, the sea kept its patient breath. Between city and surf, a father moved toward the man who had killed his son. The plain lay wide and bare beneath the moon, its contours softened by silver light. The air was cool now, the heat of the day stored in the earth and released in gentle waves. Each step of the mules was steady, the harness bells muted so as not to carry far. Priam walked with one hand on the cart, the other resting at his side, his fingers curling and uncurling against the night air, as if holding the memory of Hector's hand from boyhood days. Idaeus kept silent, his eyes scanning the horizon where Greek watchfires burned in careful lines along the shore. The fires looked almost peaceful from this distance, clusters of gold against the dark, like constellations fallen to earth. But between here and there lay the ground where countless men had fallen, where bones rested under thin layers of dust. The plain was a graveyard under the stars, and each shadow seemed to carry a presence. The mules slowed briefly where the ruts of chariot wheels had hardened into ridges. Priam's steps did not falter. In his mind, the noise of battle, the shouts, the clangor of bronze, had long since been muted by the single clear thread of purpose pulling him forward. He thought of Hector's first armor, too big for him as a youth, the helmet tipping forward over bright eyes. He thought of the day his son had returned victorious from his first skirmish, still flushed with the thrill of survival. These were the images he carried, not the broken body that waited beyond the Greek lines. As they drew nearer, the murmur of the sea began to mingle with the faint sounds of the Greek camp voices low, the creak of leather, the occasional bark of a sentry's challenge in the distance. Priam's heart beat slowly, but each pulse felt like the striking of a drum. He had walked into other courts in his life, faced kings and allies with a careful mask of authority, but this was different. Tonight he walked into the camp of his enemy, unarmed but for the weight of his grief. A shadow detached itself from the dark ahead, a Greek sentry, spear in hand. Idaeus stepped forward, speaking in the slow, formal tones of diplomacy, naming Priam and the purpose of their journey. The sentry hesitated, looking from the old king's lined face to the laden cart, then nodded once and disappeared into the night to bring word ahead. They waited there, the night pressing close. Priam gazed toward the cluster of lights he knew must mark the heart of the Greek camp. Somewhere in that glow was the tent of Achilles. Somewhere within it, the man who had taken Hector's life sat in the quiet of victory. When the sentry returned, he was not alone. A pair of guards moved to either side of the cart, their faces unreadable in the moonlight. They motioned for Priam to follow, their pace measured, respectful. The path they took wound between silent tents, the smell of salt and smoke growing stronger, the sound of the waves now a constant hush. And then, through the dim corridors of canvas and rope, Priam saw it. A single tent lit from within, the shadow of a man seated at its center, the light falling across the curve of a great shield propped at his side. The guards stopped. The air was thick with stillness. "Enter," one said quietly. Priam drew a breath and stepped forward, carrying with him the weight of a city's sorrow and a father's hope. The interior of Achilles' tent was warm with lamplight, the air heavy with the mingled scents of oil, leather, and the faint tang of sea salt carried on the breeze through the open flap. Achilles sat at a low table, his posture still and upright, the curve of Hephaestus' shield catching the glow at his side. His gaze lifted as Priam entered, and for a moment the space between them held only silence. Two men measuring each other across the span of grief and war. Priam walked forward slowly, his step steady despite the weight in his chest. When he reached the table, he did not speak at once. Instead, he removed the plain cloak that covered his shoulders and lowered himself to his knees before Achilles. It was an act that seemed to shrink the years between them, reducing king and warrior alike to their simplest roles, father and son, joined by loss. Achilles' eyes narrowed, not in anger but in the shock of what he saw. The proud king of Troy kneeling to the man who had killed his child. And then Priam spoke, his voice low, the words shaped with care. "Achilles," he said, "I have done what no man before me has done. I have kissed the hands of the man who killed my son. I come not as a king to bargain, but as a father to plead. Give me back Hector's body so that I may bury him in honor. Let him return to the city he defended, to the wife who waits, to the mother whose arms are empty." For a moment, Achilles did not reply. His hand rested loosely on the rim of the shield, his eyes fixed not on Priam but somewhere past him. Perhaps on the plain where Hector had fallen, perhaps on the face of Patroclus lying still. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than the sea's whisper against the shore. "You remind me of my own father," Achilles said. "If he were here and I were lying beyond the gates of my home, I would wish for him to have the courage you have shown tonight. You have touched my heart, old man, in a way no warrior's plea could." The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the shared understanding of two men who had given more to this war than they had ever wished. Achilles rose, crossed the short space between them, and placed his hand on Priam's shoulder. "You shall have him," he said. He called for his servants, and together they brought Hector's body, cleaned and covered in fresh linen. Priam's hands trembled slightly as he touched the shrouded form, but his voice remained steady when he offered thanks. That night, in the quiet of Achilles' tent, they shared a simple meal, not as enemies, but as two fathers bound by the same thread of human sorrow. Outside, the camp slept, the waves keeping their eternal rhythm, while within, the war's noise fell away for a brief and fragile peace. The fires of the Greek camp burned low, and beyond the walls of Troy, the wailing had softened to a steady murmur, as though the city itself breathed in grief. Yet in the stillness after Priam's night journey, the events of these long years began their slow transformation, from living memory into the fabric of a story that would outlast all who had walked its path. The Iliad, as it would be told for generations, was not a tale of the war's beginning or even of its end. It was the story of a few short weeks, seen through the eyes of warriors, kings, and gods, but bound together by something older and more enduring than victory or defeat, the measure of a person in the face of loss. In the centuries that followed, bards would sing of Achilles' wrath, Hector's courage, and the quiet dignity of Priam's plea. They would stand in halls lit by firelight, their voices weaving through the air while listeners leaned forward, drawn not just to the clang of bronze and the flash of chariots, but to the still moments. The clasp of a warrior's hand before battle, the gaze of a mother from the walls, the brief meeting of eyes between enemies who understood each other more deeply than their allies ever could. What kept the Iliad alive was not its catalogue of names or the precision of its battles. It was the recognition that beneath the armor, all men carry the same fragile core, the love of home, the bonds of friendship, the ache for meaning in the shadow of death. That truth resonated as much in the quiet farmhouses of distant lands as in the courts of kings. Even now, the listener can feel those echoes. Perhaps you, lying here in the quiet, have known your own sieges, Long struggles fought not with spears, but with the weight of days, the grind of patience, the endurance of hope. The war at Troy is far behind us, but the truths it revealed are still the truths of our lives. That anger can burn away what we hold most dear, that grief can strip away all but the essential, and that even in the heart of enmity there can be moments of unexpected grace. And so the Iliad endured, not simply as a record of what happened, but as a mirror in which each generation could see itself. In the lines of Achilles' face, we see our own fierce pride. In Hector's steadfast defense, our devotion to what we love. In Priam's courage, the lengths to which we will go for those who belong to us. This is why, though Troy fell long ago, its walls still stand in the mind, and why the plain, now silent beneath the turning stars, still hums faintly with the memory of chariot wheels and the sound of a father's voice calling his son's name. The Iliad's endurance lies not only in the grand sweep of its events, but in the way it lingers over small, human details that refuse to fade. A warrior adjusting the strap of his greave before battle, the soft glance between husband and wife in the shadow of approaching war, the way the morning light falls on an empty shield after its bearer is gone. These moments root the epic in something more intimate than legend. They root it in the shared heartbeat of humanity. Over time, its verses traveled far beyond the Aegean. They were recited in the marketplaces of bustling cities, taught in the shaded courtyards of scholars, and whispered by travelers resting under open skies. Each telling adapted to its audience, yet the core remained. An unflinching meditation on what it means to be mortal in a world shaped by forces both seen and unseen. Modern ears, listening in a world of crowded cities and distant conflicts, still find the rhythm of those truths. We may not fight on plains with spear and shield, but we know the quiet endurance of waiting, the hollow ache of loss, and the pull of pride that can lead us away from those we love. We know, too, the fragile beauty of reconciliation, the rare moments when enemies lower their weapons and see each other simply as men. In that way, the Iliad is as much about living as it is about dying. It speaks of the tension between our brief span of days and our desire to leave something that endures beyond them, whether in the memory of loved ones, in the work of our hands, or in the stories that carry our names forward. For Achilles, that immortality came in the form of song. For Hector, it came in the love of his city. For Priam, it came in the act of crossing a hostile camp to bring his son home. And so, as we step away from the firelit tents and the echoing walls of Troy, the story does not end. It folds into the long river of human memory. There it flows beside other tales of courage and loss, each telling mingling with the next until the boundaries blur and only the essence remains, that life is precious because it is finite, and that even in the shadow of death there can be dignity, meaning, and grace. Somewhere, perhaps, a poet sits in the quiet, the last light of day warming the page. He lifts his head, hearing the faint rush of the sea, and begins to shape the words again, passing them onward so that another generation may listen. And in that act, the Iliad lives, not as an artifact of the past, but as a voice that still speaks to us here, in the present clear, steady, and eternal. Before the weeks of rage and grief that the Iliad preserves, there were 9 long years of war that stretched across the plains and into the hearts of 2 peoples. Those years are a quieter shadow behind the poem's bright moments, and yet they shaped the ground upon which every later step was taken. They began with fire and ended with weariness. Years in which the edge of the sword was often less dangerous than the slow turning of time. In the beginning, the Greeks came not directly to Troy's gates, but to the lands and towns that fed her. Their black-hulled ships, sharp in the water, would appear suddenly on the horizon, sails swelling with wind. They would strike first at the coastal allies of Troy, taking what they could, bronze tools, amphorae of wine, baskets of grain. Villages that had slept in peace for generations found themselves waking to smoke drifting from their own roofs. Those who survived fled inland, carrying what little they could. Old family cups wrapped in cloth, a single jar of oil, a child still half asleep over a shoulder. These raids fed the Greek army, kept their stores from running dry, but they also served another purpose: to weaken the great city before ever laying full siege. In those early years, Troy's markets remained bright, with goods brought in from farther afield. Spices from the east, ivory from distant coasts, bolts of dyed cloth as red as pomegranate seeds. The harbour still bustled with fishing boats, their decks heavy with silver-scaled catch, the scent of salt and fish brine mingling with the warm, sweet smell of fresh bread from the ovens. Yet each year took something from the city. The granaries never filled quite as full as before. The coin for the markets seemed to flow out faster than it came in. Children who had once played in the streets grew into youths who stood watch at the gates, a spear where a game had been. Inside Troy's walls, life clung to its patterns with stubborn grace. Women still gathered at the wells each morning, their hands red and cool from the water, their voices rising in the comfort of familiar gossip. The temples were still busy, priests laying garlands of laurel, the scent of burning myrrh curling upward into the high beams. There were weddings and feasts, though they were quieter now, the music a little softer, as if the players felt the weight of what was happening beyond the city. Outside the walls, the Greeks worked to hold their siege lines. The camps stretched in long rows near the shore, the sand marked by the keels of their ships drawn up out of the tide's reach. Men repaired their shields at dusk, the bronze rims catching the last light of the sun. Others mended cloaks, set fishing nets, or sat before small fires with their comrades, speaking of home in low, even tones. The nights were long, and the wind from the sea brought both the chill of salt spray and the endless sound of waves breaking on the beach. As the years passed, the war became less about swift victories and more about endurance. The first great rush of anger and ambition faded, replaced by a steady, grinding persistence. Time wore down sharp edges. The enemy's face became familiar. The Trojans learned the Greek battle calls, could recognize the voices of certain captains across the plain. The Greeks learned the rhythm of the city's watch bells and the patterns of light in the windows above Troy's walls. Long struggles do not announce themselves like sudden battles. They seep into the days, into the joints of the people living through them. They weigh on the mornings, make each chore just a little heavier. Grain carried from the storehouse feels heavier than it once did. The climb to the city wall to watch the plains feels longer. And yet, in the same breath, there are moments of strange peace. When the air is clear, the sun is warm, and for an hour, one might believe there is no war at all. On such days, fishermen still set out from Troy's harbour, the water glassy beneath their oars. Farmers still press olives in the courtyards, the dark oil flowing into jars. A child still laughs at the edge of a fountain, watching sunlight break into patterns on the water. These small acts became the true victories of those years, the refusal to let the war steal every corner of life. But time is patient, and it wears even the strongest resolve. By the 9th year, the city and the camp alike felt the strain. Supplies came slower, repairs took longer, tempers frayed more easily. The plains outside Troy bore the marks of countless skirmishes, grass trampled to dust, old spearheads buried beneath the soil. The air seemed heavier, as though it too was tired. The Iliad does not sing of these long years in detail, but they are the quiet foundation of the tale. Without them, the quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles would have been only a moment's anger. Without them, the grief over Patroclus, the final duel between Hector and Achilles, would not carry the same weight. The years before the Iliad are the slow tide that brought all men to the shore where the poem begins. Far above the plains of Troy, where the dust never rises and the air is always clear, the gods watched. Their world was not bound by hunger or weariness or the slow grind of years. From the heights of Olympus, they could see the shimmer of the sea, the golden curve of Troy's walls, and the dark line of ships along the shore. They saw the movements of men as a shepherd sees his flock, tiny, scattered shapes upon a wide field. Zeus, the son of Cronus, sat upon his high throne. The clouds gathered thick around him like the folds of a cloak. In one hand he held the golden scales of fate, and when he weighed the lives of men, the balance shifted with an inevitability no mortal could resist. His gaze lingered on the battlefield, not with the coldness of indifference, but with the detachment of one who knows the span of every life before it begins. Hera, queen of the gods, moved through the bright halls with purpose in her eyes. She favored the Greeks, her anger toward Troy, old and unsoftened by time. Her voice, when she spoke to Zeus, was careful, persuasive, yet edged with the steel of conviction. She and Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, often stood together, their council weaving plans to turn the tide in the Greeks' favor. Athena herself walked the line between strategy and direct action. She was not content to watch from afar when her chosen warriors were in danger. Many times she had stepped onto the plain, her presence felt as a sudden steadiness in a soldier's arm, a flash of clarity in the chaos of battle. To Odysseus, she was a guiding thought in the midst of confusion. To Diomedes, the fierce surge that carried him against enemies twice his strength. Aphrodite, softer in step, had her own stakes in the war. She favored Paris, the shepherd prince who had once placed the golden apple in her hand. She moved unseen between the lines, turning the course of an arrow, shielding her chosen from the killing blow. Yet her influence was not always welcome. The realm of love is a dangerous thing when placed among the clang of bronze and the cries of war. The other gods too had their preferences. Apollo standing for Troy, sending his arrows in the form of sudden plagues. Poseidon lending the Greeks the steadiness of the sea's strength when it suited him. Ares, god of war, swayed by the heat of the moment, ready to fight for whichever side offered the sharper thrill. And though the gods shaped the fates of men, they were not untouched by them. A hero's death could stir anger, a desperate plea could win pity, and even the smallest act of courage might earn a god's quiet favor. To the mortals below, the gods' actions often seemed distant, inscrutable. Yet in truth, the divine world was bound to theirs by 1,000 threads. Threads that tugged and tangled, tightening in ways neither mortal nor god could always foresee. Sometimes, the presence of the gods was felt in grand, unmistakable gestures, a storm rising suddenly over calm seas, a wall of mist falling across the battlefield to shield one army from the other. At other times, their touch was quiet, a dream sent in the early hours before dawn, a chance meeting that changed the course of a life. The Iliad is filled with such moments, when the veil between the mortal and divine thins to nothing. For the listener here, in the soft darkness, it is worth remembering that in this ancient world, men did not walk alone. Every choice, every step, might be watched, guided, or opposed by unseen eyes. And though we no longer speak of the gods in the same way, the feeling is not unfamiliar. That sense that forces larger than ourselves move in the background of our days, shaping events in ways we cannot quite name. High on Olympus, the laughter and arguments of the gods rang like wind through the peaks. They quarreled, they conspired, they loved, they resented, and all the while, the war continued far below, each moment feeding into the balance of Zeus's golden scales. It is here, in the tension between mortal will and divine design, that the Iliad draws so much of its power. For even when men knew their fates were in the hands of gods, they still fought, still loved, still sought honor in the fleeting light of their days. And perhaps that is why the gods watched so intently. Because in the stubborn courage of mortals, they saw something even they could not claim. Within the high, sun-gold walls of Troy, the voices of women were the steady undercurrent to the city's life. While men rode out to the plain or stood guard upon the battlements, the women kept the rhythm of the days. Measured not in battles won or lost, but in loaves baked, cloth woven, and children kept safe another night. At dawn, before the heat swelled against the stone streets, the first sounds were the sweep of brooms and the creak of wooden shutters opening to the pale light. The air was cool, smelling faintly of river water carried up in clay jars the day before. Women stepped into the lanes in pairs and small groups, their voices low, shawls drawn loosely over their hair. They walked toward the public wells, hips balanced against the weight of large amphorae, their sandals whispering over worn flagstones. At the wells, the news moved as quickly as the water itself. The murmurs passed from hand to hand like the ropes tied to the buckets. Word of a skirmish on the plain, of a supply train that had made it through, of a cousin married in the shadow of war. The younger women listened with sharp attention, the older ones with the patience of those who had heard similar tales for years. In the courtyards, other work began. Some women sat at low looms, their fingers flying over the warp and weft, weaving cloth for tunics, cloaks, and wedding dowries that might yet be used. The sound of the shuttle was a soft rhythm, like the distant beat of a heart. Others pounded grain in tall mortars, the steady thud marking time while they spoke of their children's tempers. There were women whose work was more solemn. In the cool shadow of the temples, they prepared offerings, laying out wreaths of laurel, measuring handfuls of barley to scatter on the altar before the flame took it. The smell of incense wound through the air, frankincense sharp and clean, myrrh sweet and resinous. They prayed not just for victory, but for the safety of brothers, husbands, and sons, and sometimes for the strength to endure whatever the gods might send. Andromache, wife of Hector, moved between these spaces often. She was seen in the market, her hand steady on her small son's shoulder. She was seen at the loom, weaving with the other women. She was seen on the walls, looking out toward the plain with eyes that measured the distance to where her husband fought. In her presence, the women found both comfort and a reminder of the stakes. They saw in her the courage it took to love a man who stood each day between the city and the sea of Greek spears. Hecuba, Queen of Troy, walked less often in the open streets now. Age and the years of siege had made her step slower, but her presence was still felt. She met with the elders, counseled her daughters, and oversaw the temple offerings. When she did appear at public ceremonies, the crowd parted without command, their heads bowing not only to her rank, but to the quiet endurance in her face. In the evenings, when the day's heat had faded and the air turned gentle, the women gathered again in the courtyards. Some carried baskets of figs or small loaves to share, others brought only their company. Lamps were lit, casting a warm glow over the worn paving stones. Children played within the circle of light, their laughter mingling with the murmur of conversation. It was here that the sharp edge of the war seemed farthest away, softened by the smells of baked bread and oil lamps, by the sound of a lullaby hummed just above the noise. Yet even in these moments, the war was never entirely gone. The distant horns could sound at any time, calling the men back to the gates. A woman's gaze might drift upward toward the walls, searching for a signal, a shadow, a figure returning late. And when the day's fighting had been fierce, the news would pass quickly from one house to another until every name was known and every absence counted. Still, the women of Troy endured. They braided their hair each morning, tied their sandals, tended their households, and kept the city's pulse steady. They were the keepers of normalcy in a world that had tilted toward chaos. Without them, the walls would have been only stone. With them, Troy remained a living city, full of the small daily acts that make life worth defending. Within the high, sun-gold walls of Troy, the voices of women were the steady undercurrent to the city's life. While men rode out to the plain or stood guard upon the battlements, the women kept the rhythm of the days, measured not in battles won or lost, but in loaves baked, cloth woven, and children kept safe another night. At dawn, before the heat swelled against the stone streets, the first sounds were the sweep of brooms and the creak of wooden shutters opening to the pale light. The air was cool, smelling faintly of river water carried up in clay jars the day before. Women stepped into the lanes in pairs and small groups, their voices low, shawls drawn loosely over their hair. They walked toward the public wells, hips balanced against the weight of large amphorae, their sandals whispering over worn flagstones. At the wells, the news moved as quickly as the water itself. The murmurs passed from hand to hand like the ropes tied to the buckets, word of a skirmish on the plain, of a supply train that had made it through, of a cousin married in the shadow of war. The younger women listened with sharp attention, the older ones with the patience of those who had heard similar tales for years. In the courtyards, other work began. Some women sat at low looms, their fingers flying over the warp and weft, weaving cloth for tunics, cloaks, and wedding dowries that might yet be used. The sound of the shuttle was a soft rhythm, like the distant beat of a heart. Others pounded grain in tall mortars, the steady thud marking time while they spoke of their children's tempers, the latest prices in the market, or the way the priests had spoken in the temple the previous evening. There were women whose work was more solemn. In the cool shadow of the temples, they prepared offerings, laying out wreaths of laurel, measuring handfuls of barley to scatter on the altar before the flame took it. The smell of incense wound through the air, frankincense sharp and clean, myrrh sweet and resinous. They prayed not just for victory, but for the safety of brothers, husbands, and sons, and sometimes for the strength to endure whatever the gods might send. Andromache, wife of Hector, moved between these spaces often. She was seen in the market, her hand steady on her small son's shoulder. She was seen at the loom, weaving with the other women. She was seen on the walls, looking out toward the plain with eyes that measured the distance to where her husband fought. In her presence, the women found both comfort and a reminder of the stakes. They saw in her the courage it took to love a man who stood each day between the city and the sea of Greek spears. Hecuba, Queen of Troy, walked less often in the open streets now. Age and the years of siege had made her step slower, but her presence was still felt. She met with the elders, counseled her daughters, and oversaw the temple offerings. When she did appear at public ceremonies, the crowd parted without command, their heads bowing not only to her rank, but to the quiet endurance in her face. In the evenings, when the day's heat had faded and the air turned gentle, the women gathered again in the courtyards, Some carried baskets of figs or small loaves to share. Others brought only their company. Lamps were lit, casting a warm glow over the worn paving stones. Children played within the circle of light, their laughter mingling with the murmur of conversation. It was here that the sharp edge of the war seemed farthest away, softened by the smells of baked bread and oil lamps. Yet even in these moments, the war was never entirely gone. The distant horns could sound any time, calling the men back to the gates. A woman's gaze might drift upward toward the walls, searching for a signal, a shadow, a figure returning late. And when the day's fighting had been fierce, the news would pass quickly from one house to another, until every name was known and every absence counted. Still, the women of Troy endured. They braided their hair each morning, tied their sandals, tended their households, and kept the city's pulse steady. They were the keepers of normalcy in a world that had tilted toward chaos. Without them, the walls would have been only stone. With them, Troy remained a living city, full of the small daily acts that make life worth defending. The day after the fighting ceased, Troy lay under a sky that seemed washed clean. The air was still, as if the winds themselves had paused to mark what was about to happen. From the walls, one could see the plain between the city and the Greek camp, empty now of clashing warriors, littered instead with the remains of battle, broken spears, fallen helmets, and the marks of wheels where chariots had dragged the dead away. Among those, one body had been returned with care, wrapped in the finest cloth that could still be found in the city. Hector, defender of Troy, had come home. The gates opened in silence to receive him. Priam, the aged king, had gone himself to the Greek camp to beg for his son's body, crossing the no man's land at night, guided by courage and grief. Now, as the people watched, the king walked before the bier, his robes torn, his face lined deeper than the day before. Behind him came the men who had carried Hector in, their heads lowered, their eyes wet. The women of Troy wailed, not the sharp cries of battle, but the long, low sound that carries loss through the bones. Andromache stood nearest the bier, her veil pulled forward to shield her face, though tears still traced their way down. In her arms was her small son, too young to understand the full weight of the moment, but quiet in the presence of his mother's grief. They carried Hector to the center of the city, to the broad square where ceremonies were held. There, the bier was set upon a raised platform, draped with rich fabrics, embroidered in patterns that spoke of Troy's long history. Around it, the people gathered, not just warriors and nobles, but craftsmen, merchants, servants, and children. All had known Hector's name. Many had known his kindness, his fairness, his presence at the walls. The priests stepped forward first, casting handfuls of barley upon the ground and pouring out dark wine in libation. Their voices rose in slow, solemn chants, invoking the gods to receive Hector's spirit, to grant him rest among the honored dead. The smoke of burning incense rose in twisting streams, carrying with it the mingled scents of frankincense, cedar, and rosemary. Then came the laments. One by one, those closest to him spoke. Andromache told of the day they were wed, of the promise he had made to return from the battlefield, of the way he had held their child as if holding the future itself. Hecuba, his mother, spoke of his birth, of the omens that had surrounded it, of the boy who had grown into a man who never shrank from duty. Priam's voice was quieter, but steadier. He spoke not only of his son's bravery, but of his wisdom, his patience, and the rare gift of making others feel seen, even in the shadow of war. The people listened, their faces lit by the late morning sun, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that the man they mourned had been the shield of their city. Without him, the walls felt thinner, the gates more fragile. When the speeches ended, the ritual of the burial began. They washed his body with scented water, combed his hair, and placed upon him the armor he had worn in life, not for battle now, but as a sign of the honor he had earned. In his hands, they placed a sprig of laurel, its green still bright, a symbol of victory that could not be taken from him. The pyre had been built outside the gates, upon the plain where he had fought so often. It was a great structure of seasoned wood, stacked high, draped with cloth, and surrounded by jars of oil and honey. As the bier was carried there, the people followed in a slow procession, the sound of their footsteps merging into a single, low murmur. At the pyre, they laid him upon the wood and poured over him the oil and honey, the gifts of the earth and the hive, symbols of life's sweetness and the hope that the afterlife would be as generous. Torches were lit, and one by one, those closest to him touched the flame to the pyre. The fire caught slowly at first, then climbed upward, the smoke rising in a column toward the clear sky. The people stood in silence, watching as the fire consumed the body, as the armor gleamed once, then dulled as the laurel turned to ash. They did not turn away. This was the last act they could give him, the last time they would see him in the world of the living. When the fire had burned down, they gathered the ashes with care, placing them in a golden urn. The urn was carried back into the city and buried beneath a mound of earth, upon which they raised a great stone marker. Around it, they planted a ring of cypress trees, whose dark green would stand through the seasons as a sign that here lay Hector, the heart of Troy. That night, the city was quieter than it had been in years. No feasts were held, no music played. Lamps burned low in the houses, and the people spoke in whispers, if at all. The war had not ended, but a chapter within it had closed. And in that quiet, the people of Troy felt both the weight of their loss and the fragile thread of their endurance. The Iliad ends, not with the fall of Troy, not with the clash of armies, but with a funeral. In this, perhaps, there is wisdom. Wars are remembered for their victories and defeats, but those who live through them remember something else: the faces that vanish, the quiet after the noise, the moments when even enemies recognize the humanity in each other. The epic began in anger, in the heat of insult and the cry for honor. It ends in the cool of evening, with the simple act of returning a son to his father. Think, for a moment, of Priam, an old man, king of a city still under siege, walking into the camp of his enemy. He passes the watchfires of the Greeks, walks through rows of tents where men who killed his sons sleep without fear. He kneels before Achilles, the man who took Hector's life, and he speaks not as a king, but as a father. And Achilles, whose rage has consumed so much, sets aside his vengeance for a night. Two men, both bound by loss, sit together in the flicker of lamplight, sharing food, sharing silence. This, too, is part of the Iliad's truth, that even in the most brutal of stories, there are moments of grace. These moments are not loud. They do not change the outcome of the war. Troy will still fall. Achilles will still die. But for one night, the cycle of revenge pauses and the world holds still. And perhaps that is why the Iliad has endured for nearly 3,000 years. It is not simply a song of battles, it is a mirror held up to the full span of human experience. Glory and grief, pride and humility, wrath and mercy. It shows us that honor is fragile, that life is fleeting, and that even the greatest names will fade into the soft dust of memory. As you listen to these echoes, you might think of how small the concerns of today can seem beside the long river of time. The people of Troy walked through markets, tended gardens, watched their children play in courtyards, just as we do now. The Greeks sharpened their blades, argued among friends, and thought of home. We live in a different age, yet we carry the same longings: to be remembered, to protect what we love, to find meaning before the curtain falls. And so the Iliad closes, leaving us not with the end of the war, but with the image of a mound of earth under the dark sky, where a city's defender rests. The fires burn low, the walls stand for now, and the sea beyond Troy's shore breathes in and out as it always has. Time moves forward, yet in the quiet, the voices of the past are never entirely gone. Rest now. The story is told.